All right. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank everyone who's joining us or has joined us for the first of many conversations we're going to have with our graduate students. This is the beginning of a graduate student forum. It is done within the College of Education, but we are really trying to work in collaboration with the efforts established by our Chancellor, Chancellor Jones. He's put out a call of action to address systemic racism and social injustice. And we thought about our differing capacities within the College of Education and who could have a meaningful, not just conversation, but impact with regards to these considerations. And we realize that our College of Education is very blessed to have a number of graduate students who are doing effective research or teaching within these core areas. And we wanted them to have an opportunity to share their wisdom with us. We're recording these conversations. There would be a call coming out for future participants within our graduate student forum. And so you'll probably get an email from Kathy Stalter or myself asking for where you might see yourself in the tentative list of presentations that we have forthcoming. And we also have a couple other initiatives that we're excited for our graduate students to think about that will be fully articulated in that forthcoming message. That being said, today's conversation is about um, teaching diversity and inclusion in higher education. And we have three outstanding graduate students who are going to lead the panel here. The first is Alyssa Irvin. She's a graduate student in curriculum instruction. She just gave a double wave there, just in case. Our second is Dante Sudemeyer. He is a graduate student in education policy, organization, and leadership. And our third is Marisol Jimenez, and she also is a graduate student in the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership. We've shared the questions with them in advance. What we're hoping to do is for about 50 minutes, roughly, go through these sets of questions to get their insight and wisdom. And we'd like to leave maybe about 10 minutes for Q&A, if at all possible. We're gonna ask participants on this to keep their microphones muted so we don't have any extra background noise. And if at all possible, if you do have a question, type it in the chat and Professor Allen and I will be going through the chat. We're moderating. Professor Allen, I forgot to introduce her. Gabrielle Allen is our Associate Dean for Research. And I, Chris Spannon, the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs. And so we're moderating and we will do our best to get your question to our panelists. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and just get us started. For our three panelists here, what were your thoughts, if you had any, when you heard the Chancellor was developing a call to action to address systemic racism and social injustice? And I was wondering if any of you could share your thoughts on that consideration.
I guess I'll go ahead and start. But I mean, I was excited when I heard that this was being done, mostly because there are a wide array of experiences for students to have within the University of Illinois. Um, there are a lot of experiences that are marginalized, and just from working and talking with students, there are a lot of students who don't necessarily feel their voices are heard as loudly as others. So when I heard about this, I was glad about it because if nothing else, it was the start of a conversation that we could really be critical of the ways that the university is complicit and active in kind of perpetuating some of these behaviors, even when those in higher levels of administration try with have the best intentions. So I was glad for this, if nothing else, as a starting spot.
Thank you, Dante. I was gonna say I came here for undergrad, so I've been here quite a while. And I have been in many different meetings that are supposed to address systemic racism. How can we bring more students of color? How can we support them throughout the university? And I was like I felt like every year I went to this meeting and every year we discussed the same things and nothing was being done, right? Like we sit, we talk about them for a couple hours and nothing happens. And I think hearing this, it kind of shows, like the call to action shows urgency, that these are things that we need to take care of right now. And I was excited to hear, like, where are y'all gonna put this money and how are we gonna disperse it? How are we gonna make sure that we're supporting those researchers, right, that are addressing these issues and are researching it? And yeah, so I was very excited about that.
I would echo both Marisol and Dante and what each of them said. I was excited about the efforts from the chancellor and the institution. However, what my hope is that we are not participating in, like what Marisol was saying, acts of conversations and discussions that lead us to more conversations and discussions. The hope is also that with this phrase call to action, that there is actually action that comes from these conversations, and that we hold, as graduate students, and some of the experiences that we have, we are already doing the research, right? We're already doing the work. The exciting part about this is that finally somebody is seeing that the conversations that are already being had are now being recognized. So this call to action is what I'm most excited about in terms of what is happening and what will be done with these conversations as they move forward. I think the institution has an opportunity to be a trailblazer and trendsetter in the way that we address this if we do it right.
And if I could just add a little bit to that, Alyssa, you know, oftentimes when we are having these discussions, similar to what Marisol said, you see the same faces at the table. When we're having conversations about diversity or justice, if we get to even an equity conversation, it's always the Black folks, the brown folks that are showing up to these conversations, and then going out and doing the labor, often unpaid, too, and then taking on that stress as well. So if we are having this conversation as a university community with a call to action from the chancellor, we need to be seeing and hearing from those who aren't always bearing the emotional brunt of what we call this call to action for.
So I think we can move to the next question. And as Chris said, I'm Gabrielle Allen, the Associate Dean for Research. I'm very happy to be part of this forum today. And so perhaps the panel, this can tell us a little bit more about themselves. And if you could tell us how long you've been teaching at Illinois, what courses you've taught, and then how you've gone around about incorporating diversity and inclusion to address social injustice in your own instruction.
Okay, so I've taught for 1.5 years. I taught, actually I wrote this down because I don't even remember. Identity and difference in education. It's been a crazy year. So the class does count as a US minority culture class. So I had that in mind as I was like creating lesson plans throughout the semester. I knew that that's what we were gonna be talking about. So I think the most important thing to me was like teaching students socio-political consciousness. And that was important to me because I wanted them to learn like the so what. Like I'm teaching you this about racism, sexism, everything. So what, and help them understand why they had to learn this and how it was going to be useful for them as well. And I wanted them to get away from like this individualistic way of thinking where they just think about themselves and they think they're never going to experience any of these things, or because they don't experience it, it doesn't matter to them, right? So I wanted them to understand how they were a part of a greater community and how this was more of a public good, right? Like you work in these communities, you want to improve your communities, and how can we make that better? As far as diversity, I was thinking I already know that what I was teaching them, a lot of them understood it, right? But it was more than just acknowledging it and tolerating it. And I wanted them to understand and like appreciate differences. And even amongst students in my classroom, it was important for them to like sit and understand each other across differences, right? Like having these difficult conversations with each other, even though they don't always agree, like how can we still have a conversation? How can we still discuss things?
Thank you.
So I have been teaching for 2.5 years. This is actually my 5th semester. I've taught social justice, education, and society for since fall of 2018. And this semester I've added on principles and teaching literature to children and youth. So this is, a multicultural literature course, as well as a social justice course in and of itself. So implementing the material is not really the issue. It's what the curriculum is based around, and being in curriculum and instruction doctoral student is the practice of using the materials that we teach is what's important. So I incorporated I challenged the thought. So my way of adding it into the classroom is by is disrupting and shifting mindsets. So how am I encouraging my students to think in a way that they can use the material? How am I encouraging them to think outside the box and make this a humanized experience? How are they seeing a lot of the students that they'll be teaching? How do they intend to approach a lot of these students that they may not be familiar with in terms of community? So my way of including social justice into education, into the courses that I teach, is just by encouraging and imploring my students to actually use the material that they're exposed to. It's one thing to read, do the assignments, and go through the notions and practices of doing the homework and this way we do schooling. But to shift the mindset and disrupt dangerous and sometimes violent notions of how we understand social justice is critical and important for me. The way my students come in should be very different from the way that they go out by the end of the semester, in terms of our way of thinking, our way of doing, and our way of supporting one another through some of these conversations.
Yeah, and I just want to shout out Gloria Latson, Dr. Gloria Latson Billings, because she says that this idea of social justice, justice is justice, no matter what it is across the board. And so I teach identity and difference education 201 as well. I actually just taught it earlier today. But one of the way I see my role in this is, again, being a disruptor. And the way that I present this to students, because oftentimes in this class, because it's a cultural minority requirement, a lot of the students are not students of color. The majority of my classes, I can say I've never had a Black male student. And so for my students, I'm always asking, what is your role in this? How do you see yourself? And what are you going to do about it? The way that we move to work for this justice is, how do we make the ideas that we speak about in this class, how do we turn them into the practical where you're actually doing something? And so when students see themselves as a part of this actionable piece, and not just this is something that affects someone else, it's not my experience, so it doesn't really have to do with me, I think that's when we are really starting to challenge.
Thank you.
I appreciate these responses. They're candid, and they're deeply reflective, in the ways that I think many of us think about pedagogy. And I was wondering, just to extend that logic, if any of you could talk about what successes or challenges that you've faced in teaching college students about indifference or social justice and systemic racism. And if they were challenges, what did you do to go about remedying them?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I made a point in my classroom was definitely, like, in the beginning of the semester, I wanted to explain to everyone that, like, we in our class were a community. Like, that was very important to me. And every single day before class started, we spent the first 8 minutes and everyone went around and we talked about how our day was, whatever. And there was 30 of us. So it took a lot of time, I think, but I wanted to make sure that all of us got to know each other, because we were going to be discussing difficult topics. So I wanted us to all understand that we were there to help each other grow, to share with each other, to learn with each other, and to understand each other, because I think we all bring different meaningful information, right, to our classroom. So I think many of the readings in my classroom provided a qualitative analysis of what young students in elementary schools were going through, right? The racism they were going through, the oppression they were going through. But I often felt like I had a lot of pushback from my students because they would just say like, well, that's just one occasion. That's just one student that happened to in 1990, whatever it was. So when I started noticing that trend, I had to come to class with my presentation ready with like quantitative research that showed that this is still happening, right? Like schools are more segregated today, and that was like extra work I had to do, but I was like, it's really important for them to know like, here's how you can read it and understand the story, and then here's how you can read it or understand it, and that it's happening across the US still today, right? So I think that was really important. Of course, even as a woman of color, I think there was still like a power dynamic that I had to constantly think about. I had a couple of students who were much older than me, and I think I had to tackle that throughout the semester and letting them know like, I am still a TA, I'm still teaching you, and you know, we're equal because this is a learning space, and I think we all provide to the learning space, but still there's like a sense of respect that needs to be there as well.
Go ahead, Dante.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with some of the challenges. Oftentimes, what challenges look like in this class, or what I'll say the predominant challenge in this class, Education 201, looks like is silence. Students will just shut down and be quiet. And a way to deal with that, because again, we are dealing with things that are heavy. This may be the first time some of these students have ever had this type of conversation. This may be the first time that they've ever had to even think about something like this. And students will then use that silence as a form of their own disruption, because they feel if I'm quiet, you'll just move on, and then we don't have to talk about it at all. And so I am very upfront about the fact that no, if we're quiet, either we're going to sit in it and all kind of be uncomfortable, or we can talk about it and figure out why that is. Oftentimes those reasons are, you know, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to offend. I don't want to sound dumb. But it goes back to Marisol's point about creating this space, because again, if we're talking about power dynamics, then it's up until this point, most of their education has been, I am the teacher, you are the student, you listen to me, I give you everything. But we are a learning community, and we need to remember that I don't know everything. I'm learning from you. Your experiences are valid. And then you get these moments where we flip to the positive. And for example, you'll get an email from a student where it clicked and they were able to have that conversation with someone else. I got one of those recently from a student I had last semester. And that was it. Another challenge sometimes just can also be for self. It gets difficult teaching classes like this in particular times. Right now we're in an election cycle that's particularly contentious. How do you take care of yourself in that moment? At the end of last semester, we hit COVID. There was Breonna Taylor, there was George Floyd. And for me as a Black man instructor, it was also hard for me to have some of those conversations as well. So that's a challenge. But again, I will always say the successes come when you see that light go off in somebody's head, or you read that paper and you hear someone articulate an argument that they probably weren't even thinking about before you had some type of impact in their life.
So similar to Dante, which is where I was going to go with my experiences, is the identity piece. Every semester, it never fails. When we walk into these spaces, and the courses that we teach are social justice oriented, right? So we bear the responsibility of explaining and expressing and contributing to a teaching of certain topics that many of our students are not familiar with and have not engaged in. To do this and come into this space as a Black woman is always a tension that I have to disrupt every semester. It creates this notion of, it creates a preconceived notion. So I have to create the spaces that we're talking about, this brave space that we have to create for our students to understand that, like Dante said, we're learning from each other. So my responsibility as an instructor is to create a space where you feel safe enough and brave enough to have conversations that you otherwise would not have been exposed to, that you otherwise have not participated in, and you might not have the repertoire or the information to use. So my job is to provide you with the information, not just to have it, but to know how to use it. And sometimes that's challenging. Most times it's challenging, to be honest, because we are disrupting. And we're disrupting notions of white supremacy, and we're disrupting notions of racism that we have to all operate under. And many of us do not benefit from these systems, so we have to move a particular way. So if we can continue to be candid, it makes it difficult for many of us on a mental well-being type of level for us to move in spaces and have to do the work of doing this disruption while still teaching and being okay at the end of the day. This is a challenge. I also received some of these emails where you reach students, but I had a student admit to me that he did not trust my teaching at first. And at the end of the semester, this same student came to me with appreciation and support for what he learned from me. So that changed my mind about what I was capable of doing in the space that I was provided by the department. So being able to educate is something I have a passion for, but I have an expectation of my students, and I have to create a space where that's possible and where it's something that can be achieved. The successes are those students who come back and they actually get it. The successes are being able to, and the rewards are being able to reach and see how you reach those students. And at the end of the day, creating the brave space. We do shout outs in my classroom. So it's not about them celebrating me or me celebrating them. It's about them, that collective approach that Marisol was talking about. They celebrate each other. So they do shout outs at the end of every session for my social justice and education class, because I understand how difficult these topics are. So I need you to recognize your peers, see them in this space, especially those of you who do tend to be quiet. You may not know what to say, or you may be disrupting in your silence, just like Dante said. But in that, my expectation is you see your peers, because a lot of us are sharing experiences that we have to live through, and we don't always want to put a number and quantify, and storying and narratives matter. Our lived experiences matter. So my students have to understand that when I come into this space, I am passionate about what I do. And there is an expectation that you do something with this information when you leave.
Thanks for the answers. So next question is sort of going back the other way and Sam, asking you how your teaching of diversity and inclusion or social justice, how has that shaped your research or your service activities or your personal life?
I'll say that it definitely makes me more aware of who I am and what I bring. So for many of my students, I take a poll every semester. For the majority of them, it's the first time they've ever had a Black man stand in front of them as an instructor. And in a class of 30 people, and most of them are maybe freshmen or sophomore. So your entire schooling up to this point, I'm the first time that you've ever had a Black man lead you. Well, that's also a responsibility for me, because to some degree we take that on, and I represent this line of thought. I represent Black men. Although we shouldn't have to, we represent a lot of Black ideas or challenging ideas. So you have to be conscious of how you present yourself. You know, often there's a point in the class where we talk about things like code switching. But I'll have an internal moment where I have to think, is it appropriate for me to code switch now? Because this is the first time they've ever had a Black man. They may not ever have one again. And so I need to look good in this moment to represent for Black men in front of a class. is that I also end up sharing my stories, my education stories with students. So there are two alum of EPO, Dr. Arcasia and Dr. Francina, who just put out an article about Black women graduate student teachers. And it made me think about my own experiences. So as a Black boy growing up, we know that in education, Black boys are often targets. The time that my mom was called and I almost was sent to the principal's office, that could have resulted in me going to jail because I was chewing gum in class. And those are the types of things I have to think about and that I present to students to think about, because oftentimes for these social justice class and these type of diversity classes, people think racism was a long time ago and it was slavery. And it's not. There are vestiges and points of those things that are still with us now. And there are things like 6-year-old Black girls in Florida being handcuffed that just happened earlier this year in school. So it definitely is continually a process for myself. And as I'm learning about myself and learning about the student stories that I'm interacting with, I make sure that we kind of bring these together again to see our place in this. Because I would also offer racism isn't going anywhere, especially not anytime soon. And so we have to be very cognizant of that in the ways that we approach these ideas.
I would go off of that by saying, in terms of my personal life, I have two daughters, two young Black girls, who one attends middle school, the other is in elementary, and I have to be just as intentional with them and educating them as I do with my students in at school. So my personal life is social justice. I don't have the luxury of creating an isolated space for that. That's the life that I live, and it is connected to my identity and who I am. Particularly because I have daughters who I have to go out into this world and experience some of the things that I want to protect them from, and I know I can't. So that personal piece is very personal, especially like we said, if it can't be, it's not something we can just remove ourselves from and go into a different space where it doesn't exist. It's a lived experience. In terms of how it's been situated in my research, my work is motivated by changing the way that we think, see, and do qualitative research with young people. So allowing them a voice to be able to say, these are lived experiences that not only older scholars have interpreted for us, but that we are given opportunities to interpret for ourselves. This is, we're thinking about people who are affected and impacted by things that are happening in the world, and largely they are children. So how are children being protected and informed in a way where they are able to share in these experiences, and we are able to understand and learn from them in those experiences and change the way in my line of work how we teach? Because for me, pre-service teaching is critical in moments where you relieve people into school spaces that are not equipped to have these conversations and do the work that will affect my daughters and children who look like them. So this is imperative for me, and again, a lived experience. So my personal and my work is interconnected.
Thanks.
Alyssa, I think you brought up such a great point. I think as I was thinking about that, right, I think that the reason that I loved the class that I taught so much was because I knew I was teaching future teachers. Like, not all of them, but I knew a majority of them were future teachers. And I knew the responsibility that I had to at least spark something in them, for them to know something, so that they don't continue to treat students a certain way in their classrooms. I was going to say also how it relates to my research. I have always thought about educational spaces and the educational debt that we owe certain groups of students. And I think reading this even more, right, it verifies everything that I know and everything that I've felt and everything that I experienced. And how can I make these differences through my research? How can I research so that it can be meaningful, so that there could be policy change? I think it has also given me the tools even to have conversations with people, difficult conversations, because I have to have these difficult conversations with my students. So I think it has helped me that way as well.
I know we have a question that I'm about to ask, and in many ways, you guys have already answered it. But I may understand what you're saying because I do research around the concept of systemic racism. But the question that we want to ask you is, why should we pretty much care about addressing systemic racism? And again, I heard it loud and clear in your responses, but perhaps you want to elaborate a little bit more on the question um, in whatever direction you want to take it. But why should we care about addressing systemic racism?
So when I saw this question and when I hear it now, I think of James Baldwin and I think of Gloria Lasson Billings. Shout out to both of them for my sanity when I go into spaces where I have to collect myself. Gloria Lasson Billings speaks to these layers of debt. Again, so we brought up education debt, and then there's the moral debt, and then there's the economic debt, and then there's the historical debt. So why not care about or address systemic racism? It's necessary. And it permeates so heavily and throughout the structure within which we all operate. But then it also, as James Baldwin says, puts students, particularly Black children, in precarious situations that affect them for long term. There is a deep impact that white supremacy has and systemic racism has on children of color. And that impact affects their mental health and well-being. It affects the way that they think, the way that they cope, the way that they thrive, their academic trajectory. None of these things, all of these things are disrupted when we have to operate within systemic racism, because for many of us, that is a layer that we have to operate and move through. So to Gloria Lasson Billings' point, we can't address one without addressing all layers. We have to look at what historically has happened to create the problem that we're now trying to fight. We have to look at financially how investments look from one community to another and how that's been situated and structured. We have to look at how we see and position ourselves when we do the work and how we each understand social justice. This is all something that I, again, point back to James Baldwin and Gloria Lasson Billings. When I hear this question, it's imperative that we do it for the sake of the generations that come behind us. And I don't know about anybody else, but I'm positioning myself and thinking about the type of lineage and ancestor that I'm trying to be for my kids.
I agree with you, Alyssa. I also think it goes back to my point again about oftentimes people think of racism as that thing over there that other people do. And when we are talking about systemic racism, we all participate in systems. And to some degree, we all internalize racism to a degree. And that's even to say it's always shocking to students. And I mean, at one point, this was me, to hear that, Black people can perpetuate some of these things as well. Now, there's a debate on whether Black people can be racist or not, but Black people can internalize these systems of oppression because we operate under white supremacy. And so I think that particularly, and this goes a little bit to my research in thinking about universities as institutions, if these are spaces of progressive thought, as instructors in particular, it's our responsibility to not send these students out into the world unprepared or continuing the harm. We have to be thinking these types of things. I always say in my class, this is a space for you to ask that question. Don't think you sound dumb. I'd rather you ask that question here and get an answer from us, who I may have done the research on it, others may have had experiences with it. Ask that question in here before you go out and inflict trauma on someone else. And we're in a moment where diversity, equity, inclusion are these buzzwords, but we really, really, really need to be very critical about the part that universities as institutions play. And universities operate in systems of education. There's race, class, and gender associations that are associated with universities. Universities have typically and historically been exclusive. So what does that mean? How does that impact you now? What will that look like going forward? So it's important to think about systemic racism because these are systems that we cannot get away from.
Thank you. The next question is, what recommendations would you give to other graduate students who aspire to teach about these concerns in higher education? Based on your experiences.
Go ahead, Dante.
Oh no, Marisol, you go, please go.
Okay, I'll go. I was waiting for you to go so that I could help formulate my thoughts. Okay, I'm fine. What recommendations? I would say definitely learn how to take care of yourself. Like, that is the most important thing. These are very heavy topics. I think that while they are rewarding, at the same time, sometimes I would leave class and I would be like, I need to go hide. I need to go lay down. I don't want to talk to anyone. And it was a 9 a.m. class, so I was missing the whole work. But in reality, like, definitely learn how to take care of yourselves. So thankfully, I taught with 4 or 5 other people, and we would all be able to talk to each other and address some of the issues that we were having in class, right? Maybe a student who was just not trying to learn or was just saying racist stuff in your classroom or whatever the case is, right? Having a support system amongst the TAs, or I guess when you're faculty, then having other faculty that you could discuss these issues with, I think is really important to make sure that you don't go crazy.
So I was just thinking, it's important when you're teaching this class to be careful about the information that you're giving out, but not because obviously you have people looking to you as the voice of what is right. But also not only in what you're saying, but what you're demonstrating and what you're modeling for them. Often when we're thinking about like these type of conversations about diversity and justice and that type of thing, it immediately goes to race, and that race then becomes black and white. But we also have different ethnicities of students, and you don't want to leave them out of the conversations as well. When we think about demographics that the university thinks about, how often does the university take into consideration its First Nation student demographic or its indigenous student demographic? When we are thinking about justice for all students, are we thinking about those who are differently abled or have different abilities? And it's important not to leave those people out. Also, you want to be accountable not only to yourself, but you want to hold your colleagues available. So like Marisol said, we are a team of, it could be TAs. If you hear something going on with your colleagues and you hear something that may not be right, you need to speak up. There's a responsibility that we have as individuals, but particularly if you're faculty, if you're a graduate student who's an instructor, there's a responsibility that you have to make sure that you are the best that you can be for your students. And that means taking care of yourself. That also means checking yourself, because it's very easy to fall into, again, that power dynamic. I'm the one in front of the class, so I'm the one who's controlling everything. It's my word. And there are things that we don't know, right? So we are also still human. And we will make mistakes and we will say the wrong thing sometimes, but it's also about acknowledging that.
I'll just quickly say a recommendation that I would give is situate yourself as a learner. As someone who doesn't have all the answers, know everything about all the things, but that's part of creating that brave space that we talked about earlier. It's situating yourself in a way where you can have dialogue that includes you and is not just with you in the room facilitating. Become part of the conversation. And then with other graduate students, we talk about building community a lot, but sometimes connecting with colleagues, but also professors in on campus interdisciplinarily, sorry, not just in our own department, but across campus, helps us to get an understanding of how others have navigated this space that we're in right now in real time. So that has been something that I have used to thrive in this space, is connecting myself to people who have successfully done it as motivation, that I can successfully see myself through this sometimes very difficult journey. And I want to see other graduate students do the same. So building community can look very different, but it's very important, again, to all of our mental health and well-being, the way that we operate in this space. And it requires us to connect ourselves to others, and getting away from what Marisol said way earlier on, this individualistic mindset. We are here to support one another. So find that support and use them as a resource to help guide you through some of those more difficult, or some of those celebratory conversations and moments.
And I would also be remiss, I'm sorry, I just have to say, don't be careful about going into these classrooms and these spaces with assumptions. You don't know. We all, and our students are all coming to this and entering in different places with different sets of knowledge. And so you don't want to assume that because you see who you perceive to be a woman in your class, that person wants to be referred to as she. I mean, you don't know those type of things, and it's okay to ask. You don't know, there are just all types of assumptions you could make. You could be careful of saying, oh, that was retarded. You don't know who's dealing with what in that classroom, and we know all disabilities are not visual and visible. So just be careful about the language that you're using, the assumptions you're making. Again, it goes back to that responsibility.
I just want to thank you all again. This is so fantastic in terms of conversation. I feel bad because two of you TA'd for me, and now I'm like, man, I could have did something more. I didn't know Marisol was going to take a nap after she get done teaching. So, but anyway, it does lead into the next question. As if these courses or ideas aren't already tough enough to teach, we decided to sprinkle in COVID to your challenges of how you're going to teach these in a remote setting as well. But what resources do you feel are needed to effectively teach college students about social injustice and racism? And if you had kind of a magic wand, or you could take some of the resources that the chancellor's talking about putting into play, what would you do with those resources? How can we make your jobs easier? What resources do you need?
I would say the first thing that comes to my mind is the way that we address the experiences and those adverse, violent, dangerous experiences as teachers of color in these spaces. We need resources that look like support, so that we don't always feel like we are at risk when we go into the space and we don't have any support that really is enough to make change on an institutional level. So for me, the resource is a change in mindset from the institution first, because for people to do differently, they have to think differently. And that is going to require a whole shift on an institutional level. And that support has to be critical and is critical to the well-being of those of us who go into the space and require that kind of support. So that to me is I don't know what the policy or whatever that thing is looks like or what it becomes, but we are, like Dante said, we are in violent times, and these times sometimes become more subtle, but they don't go away. So when we go into spaces, we're not knowing what we are going to have to deal with, but a resource that looks like support on an institutional level is, to me, required.
I know, just in practical terms, make sure that there's some funding. Make sure that because we're still graduate students, this idea and this conversation about graduate student pay comes up consistently. But particularly right now, you know, being that we didn't necessarily anticipate going into this type of situation with virtual learning, what does that look like if I have to teach online and I don't have the Wi-Fi speed and I don't have the funds to increase my Xfinity service to be able to teach the class? If my computer won't handle it and now I need funds to do this. In times, it's not really happened in terms of teaching, but I mean, I work in another area on campus that deals with students who are in the minority on this university campus. But the idea of the tuition waiver is very important. And there was a conversation about it not being available. So if the tuition waiver isn't available, that means I can't be here as a student because I can't afford it. Particularly, I'm an out-of-state student. So that's just extra for me. And so, and just the burden and the stress of having to think about all of that. So, I mean, ultimately things get worked out and it's okay, but just that burden that took time away from me being able to prepare or to help my students because I'm thinking about, well, what am I gonna do? And if I don't do it, who's gonna be there for them? And so that goes into my last point about the people who are above us, whether it's faculty or administration. I need to see demonstrated a very intentional care and concern. Don't just want this class to be taught because it's a requirement. Don't just take this class because you have extra space on your load to be the lecturer for this class. Don't take this class if you're gonna be scared to have those conversations or if you know this isn't your area. So everything is gonna be deferred to the graduate student and who now has to take that on. So yes, pay and genuine concern.
Thank you, Dante. I was also going to say, well, I think having large classes gives you the opportunity for a lot of students to bring in their experiences and we have like rich conversations. I think maybe we would also benefit from having smaller classes. I think sometimes we're not able to reach fully all of the students when we have to worry about 32. So I think if the classes were smaller, then we could have more intimate conversations and we could focus more on individual students where I think maybe we would be able to reach them even better. So I think that would also help a lot of the teams.
Anything else? You guys are the front line for these conversations, and our College of Education thanks you on so many different fronts because as you have shared, these aren't easy conversations. They can be extremely difficult, especially if the majority of the population that you're teaching, this arguably is not only the first time they may have encountered an instructor of your background, it's also the first time they've encountered a conversation of the sort. And so how you go about navigating it, I just want to say thank you because that's beyond impressive. We have some time for Q&A with the audience if you guys are up to it. And I see there's already a couple questions. Well, they're flying in now, but I see there's a couple of questions that are on the screen. I have bifocals, so don't write too fast because once my eyes shift, I can't read anything. But I see Nicole has asked a question that some of you have touched on just a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead. Nicole, did you want to read it or do you want me to read it?
Dr. Span, you can read it. That's fine.
Okay. She asks, would you say this work of engaging difference and helping students explore difference in the classroom is more work on behalf of the instructor? And if so, how do you guys go about balancing that work with personal wellness?
I will be the first to say that I'm not good at balance, and that's just real. But I mean, it is a lot of work, and it gets heavy. There are a lot of times, particularly when we're teaching this class online, and you've just been on a computer all day, whether you're coming to it after or before your own classes, and so you could have been sitting in front of a computer for hours. I incorporate the balance in my class because I don't know that I may get it outside of my class. So we take a minute to just chill, take your eyes off the computer, get up, stretch if you need to. It's also, I just think about this because some of the folks are on this call, it's important for me to have community outside of this, but community that I can talk about these things with. So for me, I'm a social media person, but that's because for a while, I can be mindless after having to go so hard for so long.
Thank you, Dante. I see there's a question from Krishna. Krishna, did you want to ask your question or did you want me to ask your question?
Oh, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to assume I'm going to ask all the questions then. Krishna writes, is it difficult to tell if students are faking it and giving answers that they think you want to hear? And how can we deal with that if that's the case?
Alyssa, you can go after me,
Go
Alyssa. I was gonna say, I don't think it's difficult. I think it was very easy to tell when they were kind of giving me the answers that they already knew I wanted to hear. So I think for me, how I kind of dealt with that was like one of the weeks we spent 30 minutes and we had 6 tables and I gave each of them a term in CRT and then I had them explain it because I think that that's like another level that they have to learn, and it wasn't included in my syllabus, but I was like, how do I make them uncomfortable to another level, and then have them explain it to me and then have them give me an example. So I would have them do whiteness as property and they were like, we don't get it, like how are we going to learn this? And I was like, oh well, here's the book, read it, watch a video, and you guys work together at your table, explain it back to me or explain it back to the classroom, give us an example. And I had them go to that deeper level of thinking to make sure that they were actually understanding the concepts that I was teaching them.
Yeah, Marisol, everything you just said. So that I start, and I don't know, y'all could correct me if I'm wrong, but again, I'm very candid. I start every semester letting my students know, especially in social justice and education, discomfort is required. So you are going to get uncomfortable in this class because that is what is going to change the way that you respond in the world. So it's important for you to get uncomfortable, and some of the concepts might move you, but my job is to create a space where you get more comfortable with it, with having the dialogue and the discourse. But a lot of times it's easy to identify because students don't always have the language. They have the language that they're used to using. They don't have the language and the mindset. So even when they try to answer in a way that you expect or they think you expect, they still respond in the way with the language that they have. That repertoire is very important. And for those of us who have taught the same class over and over, we know this when we see it. So that this is where disruption comes in, and you disrupt that notion by changing the way that you do discourse. So we might write about it, but then we're going to talk about it. And so like Marisol said, we're going to create different types of ways to get something out of you, and that is going to require a sense of discomfort for some.
I definitely agree with you, Alyssa, because what you'll end up hearing is something like, well, it's important to be nice because everyone should be treated equally. And it like, that's how the conversation goes. And it's like, well, are you just saying that because, so I put that in context. Historically, why are we here? How does this keep happening? Where are you hearing this from? Are there some that don't? And so, yeah, like when you hear that, you just have to push. Now, some of that will also come because students don't do the readings. Because again, when we feel uncomfortable, we just stop. And so, but you can push. Or if I ask you to connect two ideas, if I'm asking you to connect Allegory of the Cave with James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village, and you're just like, I don't know. Well, let's take some time and figure it out. And then what they'll realize is that they do know these things. They just didn't want to take the time to push to get there, because they'll answer it without you telling them, you just push them.
And when all else fails, do what Dr. Span taught me in his history of education class, which is make them act out a play, act out a scene. That will always get them very uncomfortable, very vulnerable, and it'll do the job.
And a last quick point, affirm your students. I put a lot of work into affirming my students. It is my job to speak life into my students so that they understand. I had a student, a white male student, come to me a couple semesters ago and say, I don't think this is a class for me. How do I use this information? I don't have anything to offer the conversation. And I had to explain to him how much information he does have and how much he can actually learn. You should be here because you are imperative to this conversation. And what you take from this, you need to share with your peers. So now you have responsibility, and that responsibility starts with you being present.
No, this is great. I'm glad I have none of you as my TA. I'm going to tell you that right now. So I'm gonna fake it till I make it in that sense. I'm teasing. I got a comment here from a senior, Soshi, and she's in agreement about resources. Smaller class sizes produce deeper conversations. So I definitely wanted to get that shout out. But I got Taylor, who's asked 2 questions. And I'm going to try to combine.
Ask my own questions. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, can you ask one of them? Because we're a little tight on time. I was going to combine both of them.
Oh, okay. I'll throw both of them out there and then you guys can answer which one you'd like to. My first question was, do you find it difficult for your students to empathize with one another? And how do you encourage empathy? Because as we know, hearing is one thing, listening is another, understanding is another, and then empathizing is completely different. And so I heard how you guys encourage listening to one another, but not necessarily empathy. And then also, how do you challenge the thinking and push the mindsets that maybe students who are very well versed in the topic have? For me personally, I feel very comfortable in these conversations, but I don't necessarily feel like my thinking is being pushed and challenged to think deeper. So how do you encourage that as educators?
So I am not ashamed to have sidebar conversations. And when I pick up on that, I encourage sidebar conversations with students. I will pull a student aside, email them in a minute, and we will have conversation. We'll have conversation around how to extend the information that's provided. So how do we get to, sometimes collaborating with our undergraduate students is also another source or resource that we can do as well. So those students who feel like Taylor, well-versed and extremely comfortable, how can we utilize them as a partner in some of the work that we're even doing? So we can expound on some of the conversations we're having, not just in a graduate student space.
And in terms of building that empathy, I think it starts from the very beginning, really emphasizing that we're a class community, because a lot of times in these classes, students may share something that is really traumatic for them or really hurtful for them. And I think in the moment, stopping and addressing that then, because sometimes what has happened in the past is somebody will say something and it'll be like, okay, thank you for sharing. And now we've moved on and kind of left that person out there with that trauma that they just kind of exposed to the world. For me, a lot of it is me modeling that empathy, creating that sense of community. So this is a class. I don't know what you're doing when you leave here, but for right now, we all need to have each other. And if I notice that it's not going that way, like Alyssa said, those are conversations that we have on the side, because oftentimes it'll be those students, like Alyssa's student, who was like, well, I'm just a white woman. I had a young woman last semester who felt like she couldn't write the midterm because she was like, I'm a white woman. I don't think I should be saying anything to any of this. And it's like, no, we all have a role. Dr. Span is advanced in his teaching, but there are things that Dr. Span doesn't know. He's well researched. I'm not Dr. Span, so there are definitely things I don't know. So yes, we can all be well versed. My 2 degrees are in African American studies. I know some of these things, but that doesn't mean I don't know everyone in my class experience. And that experience teaches us something, and that experience is just as valid as reading Gloria Ladson-Billings. So, and I let them know that what these people are saying is important, but what you have to say in response to this is just as important.
Taylor, I was gonna say I understand where you're coming from because I took a class with you and that's how I felt. I felt like we were talking about the same things over and over and I wanted to go deeper and I feel like we were only talking about definitions and I was like, when are we gonna be asked the conversations that are actually gonna make a difference, right? So that's when I said like I use CRT and I was like, let's talk about the permanence of racism. How are we going to understand this? Like when I felt in my first semester that I taught, I felt like they didn't understand a lot and I needed to go with them at their level. And in the second semester I taught, I felt like they already grappled with a lot of the ideas that I was presenting. So I was like, how do I elevate their thinking or how do I bring in like more difficult material where we can have more conversation? So I think that that's how I brought it in.
Taylor, I remember you from EDUC 201. I have good memory of the students that sit in the class, so I appreciate your questions and comments. Ronald, I'm going to give you the chance to ask the last question, or do you want me to answer that last question? I'm going to go ahead and ask his question here. He asks, with knowing your students will be going into the real world, how do you deal with the ones that are resistant?
So Dr. Span, you and I had this conversation. This is how, when I say you reach out to those above you who have made it through successfully, this was in a situation for me with that resistance. And sometimes what the realization is that you have students in the classroom who are there specifically to disrupt in this way and very explicitly and very violently and dangerously when it comes to the well-being of us. So for that resistance though, I was taught and told that you might not always reach them all, but to reach one or to reach some is a success still in and of itself. So for those who are resistant, they're still exposed to the information. They're still going to get the issue in terms of in class. They're going to get exposed to the knowledge, whether they want to receive it or not. And that is a reflection actually of how we operate in society, because we can't reach them all out in the world either. But that doesn't stop what I consider to be teaching activism and us doing the work. So you continue to move forward. And I'm a forward thinking person. So activism is teaching and teaching is activism. So you continue to be intentional and disrupt those notions of resistance with truth.
Well, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start giving closure to this session. First by saying just deep appreciation and thank you. Gabrielle Allen and I feel privileged. I don't want to speak for Gabrielle, but I think I can by saying I feel privileged to be part of this conversation with you. This is great. I see we have an alumni who has joined us, Tamara Hoff. Dr. Hoff, I hope that you bring a lot of those students that you're recruiting from high school to our College of Education so they can get taught by our fantastic graduate students on this subject. And for all of you who have joined us for this conversation, particularly the graduate students, I hope that you see yourself as a member and panelist of our future forum. We're going to have a number of these, at least one, if not two more this semester. And I know we're going to have a full slate in the spring. But in the interim, why don't we give a warm round of applause for our panelists, Dante, Alyssa, and Marisol. Thank you guys so much. And your check of $100 minus $100 is in the mail.
Let's had a whole conversation about paying your graduate students.
Just with a $0 check.
That's not what I'm saying. You know, their tax is going to come out negative. So, all right. I'm teasing. Thank you all very, very much. And I look forward to our future conversations as we go forward. You take care. Everyone stay healthy, stay safe, stay positive.
Bye, everyone. Bye.